I thought inheriting my father's hunting cabin was his final gift to me, a place where I could follow in his footsteps as both a cop and an outdoorsman. But when I found women's clothing hidden throughout the property and discovered the underground holding cell with restraints still attached to the walls, I realized why Dad never let anyone visit. The cabin wasn't for hunting deer, it was for hunting women. And when Ranger Paul Gustav showed up at my door that night demanding I keep quiet about what never happened here.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
I understood that my respected father had an accomplice in the very man trusted to protect these woods. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, when I still believed my father was the hero I'd always thought he was. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. I remember the exact time because I was staring at my alarm clock, unable to sleep after another brutal shift working domestic violence cases for the Seattle PD. Detective Helena Elmsworth, they called me at the precinct, following in the footsteps of my legendary father, Detective Robert Elmsworth, who'd served 32 years with distinction before retiring to his beloved cabin in the Cascade Mountains. Detective Elmsworth? The voice on the other end was shaky, official. "This is Sergeant Morrison with the Whatcom County Sheriff's Department. I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your father." The words that followed felt surreal, like they were happening to someone else. Heart attack. Found by a jogger on the mountain trail near his property, pronounced dead at the scene. I sat in my dark apartment, still in yesterday's clothes, trying to process that the man who'd seemed indestructible was gone. Dad had always been larger than life, 6'3" with hands that could palm a basketball, a voice that commanded respect in any room, and a moral compass that never wavered. At least, that's what I thought. Growing up, he was my hero. The cop who worked the toughest cases, who never backed down from a fight, who taught me that justice wasn't just a concept, but a responsibility. "Your father spoke of you often," Sergeant Morrison continued, "said you were following in his footsteps, making him proud every day. There are some legal matters we'll need to discuss. He left everything to you. Everything." The word echoed in my mind as I drove the 3 hours north to Whatcom County 2 days later. Dad's lawyer, a thin man named Hector Ruffus, met me at his office in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls. The paperwork was straightforward. Dad had left me his retirement savings, his truck, and most importantly, the 40-acre property with the cabin he'd built with his own hands 25 years ago. "Your father was very specific about one thing," Mr. Ruffus said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he slid a sealed envelope across his desk. "He wanted you to have this letter before you visited the property for the first time." I tore open the envelope with trembling fingers. Dad's familiar handwriting filled a single page. "Helena, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and the cabin is yours. I know you've always wondered why I never let you visit, why I kept that part of my life separate. I told you it was because I needed space to process the darkness of the job, to hunt and fish and remember what peace felt like. That was true, but not the whole truth. The cabin holds memories that are mine alone to carry. I've kept things there that represent the worst parts of the job: evidence, files, reminders of cases that never got closure. I didn't want that darkness touching you. Take your time when you go there. Don't rush to change anything. Sometimes, the past needs to rest undisturbed. I love you, kiddo. Make me proud. Dad." The letter left me with more questions than answers, but it felt like him. Protective, mysterious, carrying burdens he didn't want to share. Mr. Ruffus handed me the keys to the cabin and Dad's truck, along with a map showing the property boundaries. "Your father was well respected around here," he said as I gathered the paperwork. "The local park ranger, Paul Gustav, knew him well. They often coordinated on search and rescue operations when hikers went missing. Paul said to tell you he's available if you need anything while you're settling the estate." The drive to the cabin took another hour on increasingly narrow mountain roads. Dad's truck, a massive Ford F-250 with a gun rack and hunting decals, felt strange under my hands. I was used to my compact Honda Civic, not this beast that smelled like gun oil and pine air freshener. The property was more remote than I'd imagined. The main road turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to barely more than tire tracks winding between towering evergreens. No neighbors in sight, no power lines, just endless forest stretching in every direction. I understood why Dad loved it here. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a hawk. The cabin appeared around the final bend like something from a fairy tale. Log construction with a steep metal roof, a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, and large windows that reflected the forest canopy. Smoke wisped from the stone chimney, which struck me as odd until I remembered the lawyer mentioning that Paul Gustav had been checking on the property since Dad's death. I parked next to Dad's ATV and grabbed my overnight bag from the passenger seat. The porch steps creaked under my feet as I approached the front door, and I noticed the wood was worn smooth in places where Dad must have sat countless evenings watching the sunset behind the mountains. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a space that was unmistakably my father's. Dark leather furniture around a massive stone fireplace, the walls lined with mounted deer heads and fish. A gun cabinet stood in one corner, its glass doors reflecting the dying embers in the fireplace. Everything was neat and organized with military precision, just like Dad's house in the city had been when I was growing up. But something felt off immediately. Not wrong exactly, just incomplete, like a stage set missing some crucial props. The cabin was beautiful, comfortable, obviously lived in, but it felt more like a showroom than a real retreat. Too perfect, too carefully arranged. I dropped my bag by the door and walked through the main room, running my fingers along the smooth log walls. Dad's reading chair sat by the window, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the side table next to it. His coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter, a ring of dried coffee at the bottom. These personal touches made his absence feel immediate and painful. The kitchen was well stocked with canned goods and hunting supplies, the refrigerator humming quietly in the corner. A note was magneted to its door in handwriting I didn't recognize. Kept the fire going and restocked the pantry. Sorry for your loss. The mountains won't be the same without Robert. Paul Gustav, Forest Ranger. Paul Gustav, the ranger Mr. Ruffus had mentioned. It was thoughtful of him to maintain the property, but something about his note bothered me. Not the words themselves, but the familiarity in how he'd written about Dad. The mountains won't be the same without Robert. It sounded like they'd been closer than just professional acquaintances. As the afternoon light began to fade, I lit a fire in the fireplace and opened a bottle of Dad's whiskey, a 20-year-old single malt he'd been saving for a special occasion that would never come. The alcohol burned as it went down, but it felt like a connection to him, like we were sharing one last drink together. I raised the glass toward his empty chair. Here's to you, Dad. I'll try to understand what this place meant to you. The fire crackled, and the wind picked up outside, making the cabin creak and settle around me. For the first time since the phone call 3 days ago, I felt a measure of peace. This place, whatever secrets it held, was mine now. Part of Dad's legacy, part of the mystery he'd been to me my entire life. I had no idea that by morning, everything I thought I knew about my father would begin to unravel. I woke to the sound of rain drumming against the cabin's metal roof and the smell of coffee already brewing. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, I thought Dad was up early making his usual morning pot. Then reality crashed back. I was alone, and someone else was in the cabin. My hand instinctively reached for my service weapon on the nightstand as I crept toward the bedroom door. Through the crack, I could see a tall figure moving around the kitchen with comfortable familiarity. My heart rate spiked until the man turned and I saw the Forest Service uniform. Detective Elmsworth? His voice was warm, apologetic. Sorry to startle you. I'm Paul Gustav, the ranger I mentioned in my note. I have a key. Your father gave it to me years ago for emergencies. Paul Gustav was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades spent outdoors. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and his brown eyes held genuine concern. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this environment, but there was something else in his manner, a careful observation, like he was studying my reactions. He continued, gesturing to several grocery bags on the counter. Figured you might want to stock up while you're here settling things. The nearest store is over an hour away. I relaxed slightly, tucking my weapon back into its holster. That's very thoughtful, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just not used to people having keys to places I'm staying.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Of course, completely understand. Your father and I worked together for over 15 years, search and rescue mostly. When hikers went missing or hunters didn't come back when expected, we'd coordinate the search efforts. Robert always said I was welcome here, especially during bad weather or extended searches. The easy way he said my father's name, the obvious familiarity with the cabin's layout, it painted a picture of a friendship I'd never known existed. Dad had mentioned work colleagues over the years, but never anyone he'd grown close to after retirement. He never mentioned you, I said, watching Paul's reaction carefully. It was a cop's habit, observing how people respond to unexpected statements. Something flickered across his features. Disappointment maybe, or surprise. Robert was private about his personal life. Even after all these years, I felt like I only knew one side of him, the professional side, you know? He'd come up here to decompress, but he kept his family life separate. That sounded like Dad. Compartmentalization had been his specialty. Work stress stayed at work, family time was sacred, and his retreat to the mountains was for solitude. At least, that's what I'd always believed. Paul helped me carry my things in from the truck while explaining the cabin systems, the propane tanks for heat and cooking, the generator for backup power, the water pump that drew from a well Dad had dug himself. His knowledge was comprehensive, almost proprietary. Your father was meticulous about maintenance, Paul said, checking the generator in the small shed behind the cabin. He had schedules for everything: oil changes, filter replacements, system checks. I've been keeping up with it since. He trailed off, not wanting to mention Dad's death directly. As we walked the property, Paul pointed out boundaries and landmarks with the precision of someone who'd spent significant time here. He knew which trees Dad had marked for future firewood, where the best fishing spots were on the small creek that ran through the property, even which areas got the best cell phone reception. He loved this place, Paul said as we stood on the porch looking out at the forest. Always said it was the only spot on Earth where he could think clearly. The isolation, the quiet, it recharged him. Did he have many visitors? Friends from the department? Hunting buddies? Paul shook his head. Never saw anyone else up here in all the years I knew him. Robert was selective about who he let into his sanctuary. I always felt honored that he trusted me with access. There was something in his tone, not quite possessive, but close. Like he'd been guarding more than just property since Dad's death. Like he had a personal stake in maintaining whatever Dad had built here. I should let you get settled, Paul said, checking his watch. But before I go, there's something I should mention. We've had some unusual activity in the area lately. Hikers reporting feeling like they're being watched, some folks finding evidence of old campsites that weren't authorized. Probably just transients passing through, but I wanted you to be aware. What kind of evidence? Fire rings that aren't on any of our maps, food caches hidden in the trees, that sort of thing. Nothing dangerous, but it's been consistent enough that I've been doing extra patrols. If you see anything unusual or feel unsafe, you call me immediately. He handed me a card with his direct number, day or night. After Paul left, I spent the morning exploring the cabin more thoroughly. It was larger than it appeared from outside, with a loft bedroom, a full bathroom with an oversized shower, and a basement level that Dad had converted into a workshop. The basement was where his personality really showed, walls lined with tools organized by size and function, a workbench that could have been featured in a magazine, and shelves of hunting and fishing equipment that represented decades of outdoor pursuits. But even here, something felt curated. Like everything had been arranged not just for function, but for presentation. The hunting photos on the walls showed Dad with impressive kills, but they were all solo shots. No hunting buddies, no shared victories, just Dad alone with his prey. I found myself comparing this version of my father to the one I'd known growing up. At home, he'd been social enough. Barbecues with neighbors, poker nights with other cops, family gatherings where he'd hold court with stories from the job. But apparently, none of that social circle had extended to his mountain retreat. The afternoon rain intensified, confining me to the cabin's interior. I tried to read one of Dad's books, but my attention kept drifting to details that seemed insignificant but nagged at me nonetheless. The locks on the doors were heavy-duty deadbolts, more security than seemed necessary for a remote cabin. The windows had reinforced glass and sturdy latches. The landline phone was an old rotary model that looked like it belonged in a museum. Most puzzling were the subtle signs of female presence. Not obvious things, no clothes or personal items, but smaller touches that suggested a woman's influence. Hand lotion in the bathroom that wasn't Dad's usual brand, a set of teacups that seemed delicate for his tastes. Even the way some of the furniture was arranged felt more domestic than the bachelor pad I'd expected. When I asked Dad about women in his life after Mom died, he'd always said he was too set in his ways for romance. "Your mother was irreplaceable," he'd say, with finality that discouraged further questions. But these small details suggested otherwise. As evening approached, I called my partner back in Seattle to check in. Detective Maggie Ruffus, no relation to the lawyer, had covered my cases while I dealt with Dad's estate. "How's mountain life treating you?" she asked, and I could hear traffic noise in the background. She was probably leaving the precinct after another long shift. "It's different than I expected. The cabin's beautiful, but there are some things that don't add up. Little things." "Like what?" I described the conversation with Paul, the signs of female presence, the fortress-like security for a simple retreat. "Sounds like your dad had a girlfriend he never mentioned," Maggie said practically. "Widowed cops aren't exactly rare, Helena. Maybe he was private about it because he felt guilty moving on from your mom." That made sense, but it didn't explain everything. Maybe it's just the Ranger knew this place better than I do, and I'm Dad's daughter. He had a key, knew all the systems, talked about Dad like they were close friends. But Dad never mentioned him once. Could be compartmentalization again. You know how cops are about separating work and family. After we hung up, I sat by the fire with another glass of Dad's whiskey, trying to piece together a version of my father that included secrets and hidden relationships. The rain continued outside, creating a cocoon of sound that made the cabin even more isolated. That night, as I settled into the loft bedroom, I noticed something I'd missed earlier. The bed was a queen size, but only one side showed wear. The left side of the mattress was firmer, the pillow less shaped by use. Dad had always slept on the right side. I remembered from childhood when nightmares would send me running to my parents' room. Someone else had been sleeping on the left side of this bed, recently and regularly enough to leave an impression in the mattress. The next morning brought clear skies and the kind of crisp mountain air that made everything feel possible. I'd slept better than I had in weeks, despite my growing questions about Dad's secret life. There was something about the absolute silence of the mountains that quieted the constant chatter in my cop brain, the endless analysis of cases, suspects, and evidence that usually kept me awake. I was making coffee when I heard the distinctive rumble of an ATV approaching. Through the kitchen window, I watched Paul Gustav navigate the trail leading to the cabin with the confidence of someone who'd made this trip countless times. He parked next to Dad's ATV and climbed the porch steps, carrying what looked like official paperwork. "Morning, Detective," he called through the screen door. "Hope I'm not disturbing you, but I have some forms we need to discuss. Property insurance, liability waivers, boring official stuff, but necessary since you've inherited the land." I invited him in, noticing again how he moved through the cabin like he belonged here. He accepted my offer of coffee and spread several documents across the kitchen table. "The main thing is the liability waiver," Paul explained, pointing to a form with the Washington State Parks logo. "Since your property borders state forest land, and we've had incidents with hikers accidentally crossing onto private property, we need updated contact information and permission protocols." As I read through the paperwork, Paul wandered around the kitchen with his coffee, opening cabinet doors and checking supplies with casual familiarity. "Your father always kept emergency medical supplies in here," he said, opening a cabinet near the sink. "Figured you should know where everything is, just in case." The cabinet was indeed stocked like a first aid station: bandages, antiseptic, pain medication, even a suture kit. More medical supplies than seemed necessary for basic outdoor activities. "Did Dad do a lot of medical assistance for lost hikers?" I asked. "Oh yes, all the time. We'd get calls about people injured on the trails, and Robert was often the first responder while I coordinated with rescue teams. He had EMT training from his police work, you know." I didn't know. Dad had never mentioned medical training, and in all my years growing up, I'd never seen him treat anything more serious than scraped knees. Paul continued his casual inspection of the cabin while I filled out the forms. He checked the locks on the windows, tested the phone line, even examined the stone fireplace like he was looking for something specific. "Everything seems to be in good order," he said with satisfaction. "Robert always maintained this place perfectly." "You seem to know the cabin as well as he did," I observed, watching his reaction. Paul smiled, but something flickered in his eyes. When you spend 15 years helping someone with search and rescue operations, you get familiar with their equipment and procedures. Robert was very systematic about everything, had protocols for every situation. That word, protocols, struck me as odd. This was supposed to be Dad's retreat, his escape from the procedural world of police work. Why would he need protocols for relaxation? "What kind of protocols?" I asked. "Oh, safety procedures, communication schedules, check-in times when he was here alone. The mountains can be dangerous, especially in winter. We always made sure to account for each other's whereabouts." Paul gathered his paperwork and prepared to leave, but paused at the door. "Detective, there's something else I should mention. I've been thinking about those unusual activities I told you about yesterday, the unauthorized campsites and such." "What about them?" "I'm wondering if they might be connected to some old cases your father worked on. He mentioned once that sometimes people from his past would try to find him up here. People who held grudges, felt they'd been wronged by his investigations." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "He never mentioned anything like that to me." "Robert was protective of you. He wouldn't want you worrying about threats that might never materialize. But I've been wondering if someone might be watching the property, waiting to see who inherited it." After Paul left, his words echoed in my mind. The idea that Dad might have had enemies who knew about the cabin added a sinister dimension to the isolation I'd found so peaceful. I tried calling the Seattle PD to ask about any threats Dad might have received, but the landline was dead. I spent the afternoon hiking the property boundaries, partly to familiarize myself with the land and partly to look for signs of the unauthorized activity Paul had mentioned. The terrain was more varied than I expected. Dense forest giving way to rocky clearings, a creek that wound through a small valley, and several natural caves formed by granite outcroppings. Near the eastern boundary, I found what Paul must have been referring to: a fire ring made from carefully arranged stones, clearly not natural, but also not recent. The ashes were old, scattered by weather, but the ring itself was intact. Nearby, I discovered the remnants of a primitive shelter. Branches lashed together with rope that had rotted away, leaving only the frame. But something about the site bothered me. It wasn't positioned like a typical hiker's campsite. Instead of being near the creek for water access or in a clearing for visibility, it was hidden in a dense thicket, almost like someone had been trying to avoid detection rather than simply camp for the night. I was examining the rope remnants when I heard voices in the distance, not close, but carried on the wind from somewhere deeper in the forest. Male voices, too far away to make out words, but with an urgency that made me freeze. Moving as quietly as possible, I followed the sound through the trees. The voices grew clearer as I approached, and I realized they were coming from a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the old campsite. "Told you we needed to wait longer," one voice was saying. "Can't keep putting this off," another replied. I crept closer, using the thick trunk of an old-growth pine as cover. Two men stood in the clearing, both wearing hunting gear and carrying large backpacks. One was older, maybe 60, with a gray beard and the weathered look of someone who spent serious time outdoors. The younger one appeared to be in his 30s, lean and nervous, constantly scanning the forest around them. "She's been here 2 days already," the younger man said. "Paul said she's asking questions." My blood went cold. They were talking about me. "Paul knows what he's doing," the older man replied. "We stick to the plan. If she gets too curious, we handle it the same way we handled the others." The others. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I pressed myself against the tree trunk, my service weapon suddenly feeling inadequate against whatever these men represented. "Robert never should have involved his daughter," the younger man continued. "This complicates everything." "Robert's dead," the older man said flatly. "What he should or shouldn't have done doesn't matter anymore. What matters is protecting what we've built here." They shouldered their packs and began moving deeper into the forest, away from my position. I waited until their voices faded completely before emerging from my hiding spot, my mind racing with implications. These men knew Paul Gustav. They knew about me, knew I was asking questions, and they'd referred to the others and what we've built here in a way that suggested something far more organized than random trespassers. Most terrifying of all, they'd mentioned handling me the same way we handled the others. I made my way back to the cabin as quickly as possible without running, constantly checking over my shoulder for signs of pursuit. The peaceful mountain retreat suddenly felt like a trap, with me as the prey wandering blindly into whatever web Dad had left behind. Back at the cabin, I tried the landline again, still dead. My cell phone showed no signal, as Paul had warned. The isolation that had seemed like a blessing now felt like a vulnerability. I needed to get back to town, needed to contact my department, needed backup. But as I gathered my things, I realized I had a decision to make. I could run, leave this mystery unsolved, and always wonder what Dad had been involved in. Or I could stay and uncover the truth, using my training and instincts to understand what had happened in these mountains. The cop in me won. Whatever secrets Dad had been keeping, whatever Paul Gustav was really up to, whatever those men in the forest were protecting, I was going to find out. But first, I needed to search the cabin more thoroughly. If Dad had been involved in something criminal, there would be evidence. There always was. And deep down, despite the growing fear, I still hoped I was wrong about everything. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of packing up and heading back to Seattle, I was going to investigate. My father had taught me that running from problems only made them bigger, and whatever was happening in these mountains, I was already involved, whether I liked it or not. I started with what I knew. Dad was a methodical man who documented everything during his police career. If he was involved in something up here, there would be records. I just had to know where to look. The basement workshop became my command center. I cleared off Dad's workbench and spread out everything I'd found so far. The liability forms Paul had brought, the map of property boundaries, even my rough sketch of where I'd encountered the two men in the forest. Looking at it all together, patterns started to emerge. The unauthorized campsites Paul had mentioned weren't random. According to the property map, they were all positioned along natural corridors that led deeper into the state forest, like waypoints in a larger route. And the clearing where I'd overheard the conversation was marked on Dad's map with a small X in pencil, so faint I'd almost missed it. I spent hours going through Dad's hunting journals, looking for any mention of Paul Gustav or unusual activities. The entries were mostly routine: weather conditions, game sightings, equipment maintenance. But starting about 5 years ago, the tone shifted. Entries became shorter, more cryptic. Instead of detailed observations about wildlife, there were brief notes with times and coordinates. PG confirms delivery route clear, 0300 hours. Package secured at waypoint 3, weather favorable for transport. New client specifications require adjustment to timeline. Package, client, transport. These weren't the words of a retired cop enjoying peaceful hunting trips. Around midnight, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tucked inside the back cover of Dad's 2019 journal was a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn map of the local trail system, but with modifications I'd never seen on any official Park Service map. It showed several structures that didn't exist on the public trails, small buildings marked as staging areas and routes labeled as extraction paths. But most disturbing were the notations along certain trails. Names, mostly female, with dates beside them. Some names were crossed out in red ink. I recognized one of the names immediately: Sarah Mitchell. She'd been a missing hiker case that made regional news 2 years ago. A 28-year-old teacher from Portland who'd vanished while backpacking alone in the Cascades. The search had been called off after 2 weeks when no trace of her was found. According to Dad's map, Sarah Mitchell's name was crossed out in red, with the date that matched exactly when she'd disappeared.
My hands shook as I counted the crossed-out names. 12 in total, spanning the last 5 years. 12 women who, according to this map, had never made it out of these mountains. I photographed everything with my phone's camera, despite having no signal to send the images anywhere.
Evidence was evidence, and I needed to document what I was finding in case something happened to me. The sound of an ATV engine in the distance made me freeze. It was past 1 a.m. Who would be driving through the forest at this hour? I killed the lights in the basement and crept upstairs to peer through the living room window. Paul Gustav's ATV was parked at the edge of the tree line, but he wasn't on it. I could see his silhouette moving between the trees, carrying what looked like a large duffel bag. He disappeared into the forest, heading in the direction of the clearing where I'd overheard the conversation earlier. This was my chance. If Paul was involved in whatever Dad had been doing, his ATV might contain evidence. I grabbed my flashlight and service weapon, then slipped out the back door of the cabin. The night air was frigid and crystal clear, the stars providing enough light to navigate once my eyes adjusted. I moved carefully through the trees, using the skills Dad had taught me during our few camping trips when I was younger. Stay low, watch for branches that might snap, place your feet carefully. Paul's ATV was unlocked, the keys still in the ignition. The storage compartment contained standard Ranger equipment, first aid supplies, emergency flares, rope. But underneath the official gear, I found something that didn't belong. A manila folder labeled Transport Logistics. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, showing women hiking alone on various trails. Some photos were clearly taken with a telephoto lens from concealment, catching the subjects unaware. Each photo was labeled with a name, date, and trail location. I recognized several faces from missing person reports I'd seen over the years, cases that had been classified as accidental deaths or unexplained disappearances. But according to these photos, someone had been stalking these women, documenting their movements before they vanished. At the bottom of the folder was a recent photo that made my stomach drop. It showed me arriving at the cabin 3 days ago, getting out of Dad's truck with my overnight bag. The timestamp indicated it had been taken within an hour of my arrival. I'd been under surveillance since the moment I got here. A branch snapped behind me, and I spun around to find Paul Gustav standing 10 feet away, his face illuminated by moonlight. He wasn't carrying the duffel bag anymore, and his hands were empty, but there was something predatory in his posture. "You shouldn't be going through other people's property, Detective," he said quietly. I kept my weapon holstered but ready, my training taking over, despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "And you shouldn't be photographing people without their consent, Paul, especially people who end up missing." He stepped closer, and I could see his expression more clearly. Gone was the helpful, concerned Ranger from our earlier interactions. This was someone else entirely, calculating, dangerous. "Your father understood the necessity of documentation," Paul said. "He appreciated the importance of keeping detailed records. It's what made him such a valuable partner." "Partner in what?" Paul smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen. "Your father never told you about his retirement income, did he? About how a cop's pension stretches so much further when supplemented with other revenue streams." The implication hit me like a physical blow. "You're trafficking people." "We are providing a service," Paul corrected. "There are clients with very specific requirements, and we've developed efficient methods for meeting those requirements. Your father's law enforcement background was invaluable for understanding how investigations work, how to avoid leaving traces that might be discovered." I thought about the crossed-out names on Dad's map, the missing hikers, the remote location of the cabin, the perfect setup for making people disappear without a trace. The women in those photos were carefully selected based on specific criteria, Paul finished. Solo hikers with minimal local connections, following routes that isolated them from other travelers. Your father had an excellent eye for identifying suitable candidates. My father, the man I'd idolized my entire life, who taught me about justice and protecting the innocent. According to Paul, he'd been hunting women in these mountains for years. "I don't believe you," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't entirely true. Too many pieces were falling into place, too many details suddenly making terrible sense. Paul reached into his jacket, and I drew my weapon in response. But instead of a gun, he pulled out a satellite phone. "I think it's time you met the rest of the operation," he said, pressing a button on the device. Static crackled from the phone's speaker, followed by a voice I didn't recognize. "Gustav here. Is she ready for the tour?" Paul looked at me with something that might have been pity. "She's ready. Bring the truck to the cabin. We'll take her to see the facility." The facility? My father hadn't just been involved in trafficking. He'd built infrastructure for it. And now, apparently, I was going to see exactly what kind of legacy he'd left behind. "Lower your weapon, detective," Paul said calmly, as if we were discussing the weather instead of human trafficking. "You're going to want to see this with clear eyes." I kept my gun trained on him, my mind racing through tactical options. I was outnumbered, in unfamiliar territory, with no backup coming. But I was also a trained police officer with 15 years of experience, and Paul was underestimating me if he thought I'd go quietly. "The truck will be here in 10 minutes, Paul continued, pocketing the satellite phone. "That gives us time to discuss your options." "My options?" "You have 3 choices, Helena. You can join the family business. Your father always hoped you would, eventually. You can walk away and pretend you never found anything, though that would require certain assurances. Or you can try to fight this and end up like the others." The casual way he referenced murder made my skin crawl. "There's a 4th option. I arrest you and shut down whatever sick operation you're running." Paul laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in the quiet forest. "With what backup? What jurisdiction? We're miles from the nearest cell tower, and the local sheriff's department has been very understanding about not interfering with federal operations in this area." "Federal operations?" "Your father didn't tell you much about his consulting work after retirement, did he? The private contracts, the special projects that required his particular expertise?" Before I could respond, the rumble of a heavy vehicle approached through the trees. Headlights swept across the clearing as a large military-style truck emerged from a trail I hadn't known existed. The vehicle was matte black, with no identifying marks or license plates visible. 2 men climbed out of the cab, the same 2 I'd overheard talking in the forest earlier. Up close, they looked even more dangerous. The older man had the bearing of ex-military, while the younger one moved with the nervous energy of someone accustomed to violence. "Evening, Detective Elmsworth," the older man said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "I'm Guy Edwards. This is my associate, Hector Ruffus. We worked with your father for several years." I kept my weapon ready, though I was beginning to realize how futile resistance might be. "Worked doing what, exactly?" "Procurement and logistics," Guy replied smoothly. "Your father had a gift for identifying assets that met our clients' specific requirements. His law enforcement background gave him insights into behavioral patterns, risk assessment, operational security." The way they talked about human beings as assets and requirements made me sick. But I forced myself to stay focused, to gather as much information as possible. "Get in the truck, Detective," Paul said. "It's time you understand the scope of your inheritance." They clearly weren't going to let me walk away, and fighting 3 armed men in the middle of nowhere would be suicide. I holstered my weapon, but kept my hand near it as I climbed into the truck's passenger compartment. The interior was more sophisticated than the exterior suggested. Multiple monitors lined one wall, showing what appeared to be surveillance feeds from various locations. Communication equipment filled another section, with radio arrays and satellite uplinks that spoke to serious funding and organization. "Impressive, isn't it?" Guy said, as the truck began moving deeper into the forest. "Your father helped design most of these systems. He understood the importance of real-time intelligence and secure communications." We drove for about 20 minutes, along what felt like a barely maintained logging road. The truck's suspension handled the rough terrain with ease, suggesting it had been modified for this specific purpose. Through the small windows, I caught glimpses of structures in the trees, platforms, cameras, what might have been motion sensors. Perimeter security, Hector explained, noticing my attention. Your father was paranoid about unauthorized access to the operational area. Every inch of the approach routes is monitored. Finally, we stopped at what looked like an abandoned mining facility. Concrete buildings partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, with heavy steel doors and barred windows. But the abandonment was clearly staged. I could see fresh tire tracks, maintained electrical lines, and the subtle signs of ongoing use. Welcome to the processing center, Paul announced as we climbed out of the truck. Your father's greatest achievement. The main building looked like a cross between a prison and a medical facility. The windows were covered with steel mesh, and I could hear the hum of ventilation systems working to maintain air circulation. Solar panels on the roof suggested the facility was off-grid, but still fully operational. Guy produced a keycard and led us through a series of security doors. Each barrier was more sophisticated than the last. Biometric scanners, weight-sensitive floors, even what appeared to be chemical detection systems. Security was always Robert's top priority, Guy explained as we moved through the facility. He understood that operational security was the difference between success and prison. The interior corridors were clean and well lit, with fresh paint and modern fixtures. This wasn't some ramshackle criminal operation. It was a professional facility designed for long-term use. How long has this been operating? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. In its current form, about 8 years, Paul replied. But your father had been developing the concept for much longer. He always said that retirement gave him time to think about more efficient approaches to problems he'd encountered during his police career. We stopped at a heavy steel door marked with warning signs about authorized personnel only. Guy swiped his keycard and entered a numeric code on an adjacent keypad. This is where your education really begins, he said, his hand on the door handle. Your father wanted you to see this eventually. He believed you had the right temperament for the work.
The door swung open to reveal a corridor lined with smaller doors, each equipped with observation windows and electronic locks. The setup was unmistakably that of a detention facility, but unlike any prison I'd ever seen. Individual holding units, Hector explained with professional pride, climate-controlled, monitored 24/7, designed for both security and comfort. Your father insisted on maintaining certain standards. I approached the nearest door and looked through the observation window. The cell beyond was furnished like a modest hotel room, bed, desk, even a small television. But there was no hiding the fact that it was a cage, complete with cameras in every corner and a door that could only be opened from the outside. And sitting on the bed, reading a book, was a young woman I recognized from the missing person photos in Paul's ATV. She was alive. They were keeping them alive. The woman in the cell looked up as my shadow crossed the observation window. She was maybe 25, with shoulder-length brown hair and the kind of athletic build that suggested she'd been a serious hiker. When she saw me looking in, she stood and walked to the door, pressing her hand against the glass. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear through the soundproof barrier, but her expression was clear enough, desperation mixed with hope, as if she thought I might be there to help her. Sarah Mitchell, Guy said, following my gaze, disappeared from the Pacific Crest Trail 2 years ago, officially listed as a presumed hiking accident. I stared at him in horror. You've been holding her for 2 years? She's been in transition, Paul corrected, learning new skills, adapting to different expectations. The process takes time, especially for the more resistant subjects. The clinical language they used to describe kidnapping and imprisonment made my stomach turn. I forced myself to look away from Sarah's pleading eyes and focus on gathering information. How many are you holding here? Currently, 8, Hector replied, consulting a tablet he'd pulled from his jacket, though the number fluctuates based on client demands and acquisition schedules. 8 women, 8 human beings trapped in this underground nightmare while the world above assumed they'd simply vanished into the wilderness. We moved down the corridor, passing more cells. Some were occupied, others empty and waiting. The occupied cells held women of various ages, all matching the profile I'd seen in the photographs:
Young, attractive, physically fit. Solo hikers who'd made the mistake of choosing remote trails where no one would witness their disappearance. Your father was very particular about selection criteria, Guy explained as we walked. He understood that certain types of people would be missed more than others. Solo travelers with minimal local connections, people who were already engaged in risky behavior. You mean hiking alone? Exactly. Society already accepts that solo hiking is dangerous, that people disappear in the wilderness all the time. It provides perfect cover for acquisition operations. At the end of the corridor was a larger space that had been converted into what could only be described as a classroom. Whiteboards covered one wall, filled with schedules and training curricula. Desks were arranged in neat rows, and educational materials were stacked on shelves along the walls. Orientation and skill development, Paul said proudly. Your father designed the curriculum himself. Language training, cultural adaptation, behavioral modification, everything necessary to prepare assets for their new roles. I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just a holding facility, it was a training center for human trafficking victims. They were systematically breaking down these women's identities and rebuilding them according to client specifications. The international market has very specific requirements, Guy continued. Clients want educated, English-speaking women who can adapt to different cultural contexts. Your father understood that the right preparation dramatically increases asset value. Asset value, I repeated, the words casting like poison. A properly trained subject can command prices in the high six figures, Hector added, consulting his tablet again. The investment in facilities and training time pays for itself many times over. They were talking about selling human beings like livestock, and they seemed proud of their efficiency. As we toured the facility, I began to understand the scope of the operation. This wasn't some amateur criminal enterprise. It was a sophisticated business with multiple revenue streams. Some women were being prepared for international trafficking, others for domestic clients with specific requirements. The facility even had a medical wing where I glimpsed surgical equipment and recovery rooms. Cosmetic modifications, Paul explained when he noticed my attention. Some clients prefer very specific physical characteristics. Your father insisted on using qualified medical professionals for all procedures. The clinical precision of it all was somehow more horrifying than simple brutality would have been. They'd turned human trafficking into a science, with my father as the architect of their methodology. Why are you showing me this? I asked as we completed the tour. Because you're Robert's daughter, Guy replied. He always planned for you to inherit the operation eventually. He believed you had the right combination of intelligence and moral flexibility to take things to the next level. Moral flexibility? The ability to see past conventional ethical constraints to the bigger picture, Paul clarified. Your father understood that society's rules are arbitrary constructs that limit potential. He saw opportunities where others saw only obstacles. We returned to the main entrance, where the truck waited to take us back to the cabin. As we prepared to leave, Guy handed me a thick folder. Your father's operational manual, he said. Everything he learned about acquisition, processing, and distribution. He wanted you to have time to study his methods before making your decision. What decision? Whether to continue the family business or forfeit your inheritance, Hector said bluntly. The operation needs leadership, and your father specified that you should have first right of refusal. Back at the cabin, they made their expectations clear. I had 3 days to review the materials and decide. Either I joined the operation and inherited my father's role, or I would be treated as a security threat. Think carefully, detective, Paul said as they prepared to leave. Your father built something remarkable here. It would be a shame to see it dismantled because of misplaced sentimentality. After they drove away, I sat in the cabin's living room with my father's operational manual spread across the coffee table. Page after page of detailed procedures for stalking, abducting, and processing human beings. Methodical documentation of years spent perfecting techniques for making women disappear. But buried in the clinical language and procedural details, I began to notice inconsistencies, small things at first, timing discrepancies, missing documentation, gaps in the chain of custody records. My father had been keeping 2 sets of books, and if I was reading the hidden patterns correctly, he'd been planning something his partners didn't know about. I spent the entire night analyzing my father's operational manual, and what I discovered shook me to my core. On the surface, it appeared to be exactly what Guy and Paul claimed, a comprehensive guide to human trafficking operations. But underneath the obvious content, I found a different story entirely. Dad had been meticulous about documentation, but not in the way his partners believed. Hidden within the procedural notes were careful records of evidence, locations where victims had been held, details about the buyers, even financial records showing money transfers, everything a law enforcement officer would need to build an airtight case. But more disturbing were the personal notes he'd hidden in margins and coded references. Comments like, HR becoming increasingly unstable, and PG suspects nothing, continues to trust completely. He'd been documenting his partner's behavior, building psychological profiles of the men he was working with. The timeline told a chilling story. Dad had initially joined the operation as an undercover investigation, but somewhere along the way, something had changed. The tone of his notes shifted from clinical observation to personal involvement. Phrases like necessary sacrifices and acceptable losses appeared more frequently. Had my father gone deep cover and lost himself in the role, or had he genuinely become what he was investigating? A soft knock at the cabin door made me freeze. It was barely dawn, too early for social visits, and after yesterday's revelations, any unexpected visitor was a potential threat. I grabbed my service weapon and approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman I didn't recognize. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with dirty blonde hair and clothes that looked like they'd been slept in. But what caught my attention was her posture. She kept looking over her shoulder like she was being followed. "Please," she called softly through the door. "I know someone's in there. I need help." Every instinct told me not to open the door. This could be a trap, a way for Paul and his associates to test my loyalty or manipulate me into a compromising position. But the desperation in her voice sounded genuine. I opened the door but kept my weapon ready. "Who are you?" "My name is Lillian Edwards," she said, and I noticed she was shivering despite the mild morning temperature. "I escaped from the facility last night. I've been hiding in the woods, but I think they're tracking me." Lillian Edwards. I remembered seeing that name on one of the recent entries in Paul's surveillance photos. A solo hiker who'd gone missing 3 weeks ago near the Canadian border. "How did you escape?" "There was a power failure around midnight," she explained, glancing nervously at the tree line. "The electronic locks failed, and I managed to get out of my cell. But I could only free 2 others before the backup generators kicked in." 2 others? If Lillian was telling the truth, there were at least 2 more women out there in the wilderness, probably being hunted by Paul and his team. I made a decision that went against every tactical protocol I'd ever learned. I let her inside. "You're his daughter," she said immediately, studying my face. "You look like him. Robert talked about you sometimes when he thought no one was listening." "What did he say?" "That he was sorry, that he'd made choices he couldn't undo, but maybe you could finish what he started." Lillian moved to the window and peered out through the curtains. "He said he'd left you everything you needed to bring them down." "Everything I needed?" "Hidden somewhere in the cabin. He was always talking about insurance policies and contingency plans. The other women thought he was crazy, but I believed him. He was different from the others, like he was fighting against something inside himself." I thought about the inconsistencies I'd found in Dad's manual, the careful documentation that could serve as evidence against his partners. Maybe Lillian was right. Maybe Dad had been planning to expose the operation from the inside. "We need to find the others," I said, "the women who escaped with you." Lillian shook her head. "Maggie headed north toward the highway. She used to be a marathon runner, figured she could outrun any pursuit. But Rosie?" She trailed off, tears forming in her eyes. "What about Rosie?" "She was hurt during the escape, twisted her ankle badly when we were climbing out through the ventilation system. I wanted to help her, but she insisted I go ahead, said someone needed to get word to the outside." The sound of ATVs in the distance made us both freeze. Multiple engines, moving fast through the forest in what sounded like a coordinated search pattern. "They found the breach," Lillian whispered. "They'll be here soon." I helped her move away from the windows and started gathering the evidence I'd found. Dad's manual, the photographs from Paul's ATV, anything that could help build a case against the operation. But even as I worked, I realized how hopeless our situation was becoming. We were trapped in a remote location with no communication, surrounded by men who had every reason to make us disappear. Even if we could evade immediate capture, we'd never make it to civilization on foot before they caught up with us. That's when I remembered something from Dad's manual. Hidden in a section about emergency protocols was a reference to a final contingency plan located in what he called the foundation of everything. The cabin's foundation. Dad had built this place himself, which meant he could have hidden something in the structure itself. "Help me move this furniture," I told Lillian, pointing to the heavy couch that sat in front of the stone fireplace. There might be something hidden underneath. We wrestled the couch aside, revealing the wooden floorboards beneath. Most of them looked normal, but near the fireplace, I noticed one board that didn't quite match the others. The wood grain was similar, but the color was slightly different, like it had been replaced more recently. I found a crowbar in Dad's toolbox and pried up the board. Underneath was a small metal box, waterproofed and locked with a combination mechanism. The ATV sounds were getting closer. We had maybe 5 minutes before they reached the cabin. I tried Dad's badge number, his birth year, my birthday. Nothing worked. Then I remembered something he used to say when I was growing up, whenever I asked him about his work. "Justice is patient, but it never sleeps." Justice. In police code, that would be 10-4. I tried 104, then 0104. On the third attempt, the lock clicked open. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. Not more evidence of the trafficking operation, but something far worse, proof that the operation extended well beyond what I'd already discovered. Financial records showing payments from government agencies, photographs of officials I recognized from news reports, communication logs referencing asset transfers to overseas military contractors. My father hadn't just been running a human trafficking ring, he'd been supplying women to government black sites and private military companies operating in conflict zones. And according to the final document in the box, a letter addressed to me in Dad's handwriting, he'd been planning to expose everything before his death. The sound of boots on the cabin's front porch told me our time was up. "Detective Elmsworth," Paul's voice called through the front door, artificially calm but with an underlying edge. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." I shoved Dad's letter into my jacket pocket and quickly scattered the other documents back into the metal box. Lillian crouched behind the kitchen counter, her eyes wide with terror. The poor woman had just escaped from hell, only to be tracked down within hours. "We also know you have our missing asset with you," Guy's voice added. "Let's handle this professionally." Asset? They were talking about Lillian like she was stolen property. I helped Lillian to her feet and whispered, "Back door. Move quietly through the trees toward the creek. Follow it downstream for about a mile. There's an old logging road that connects to the highway." "What about you?" she whispered back. "I'm going to buy you time and try to get evidence out to the authorities." Before she could protest, I pushed her toward the rear of the cabin. The back door opened silently. Dad had maintained everything perfectly, including oiling the hinges to prevent squeaks. I watched Lillian disappear into the forest before turning back to face whatever was coming through the front door. "Helena," Paul called again, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Open the door and let's discuss your options like civilized people." I positioned myself behind Dad's gun cabinet, which provided both cover and access to additional weapons if needed. "The door's unlocked, Paul. Come on in and we'll talk." The front door opened slowly, and Paul entered first, his hands visible but close to the weapon on his belt. Guy followed while Hector remained on the porch, probably watching for escape routes. "Where is she?" Guy asked without preamble, his eyes scanning the cabin's interior. "Where's who?" "Don't play games," Paul snapped, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking. "Lillian Edwards escaped last night. Tracking indicates she came here." "I've been alone since you left yesterday," I lied, smoothly. "Maybe your tracking is off." Guy moved toward the kitchen while Paul kept his attention on me. I realized they were conducting a professional search, which meant they'd find evidence of Lillian's presence soon enough. "Your father would be disappointed in you," Paul said, trying a different approach. He understood the bigger picture, the necessity of difficult choices. "What bigger picture?" The world is full of predators, Helena. Always has been, always will be. We simply recognized that reality and found a way to profit from it while providing a valuable service. Valuable service? Do you know what happens to young women who disappear in places like Afghanistan, Syria, or Somalia? Guy called from the kitchen, where he was examining 2 coffee cups I'd forgotten to hide. They end up in situations far worse than our facility. At least we maintain standards, provide training, ensure our assets go to clients who appreciate quality. The casual way they discussed human slavery as a business model made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to remain calm, to keep gathering intelligence about their operation. So you're the good guys in this scenario? We're realists, Paul replied. Your father understood that law enforcement is ultimately about managing crime, not eliminating it. Better to control something and profit from it than let it happen chaotically. Hector's voice came from the porch. Fresh footprints leading toward the tree line. She was definitely here. Guy emerged from the kitchen, holding up one of the coffee cups. Still warm. She can't have much of a head start. I had to keep their attention focused on me, give Lillian as much time as possible to reach safety. You said my father was planning to bring me into the operation. When did that conversation happen? About 6 months before his death, Paul answered. He was getting older, worried about succession planning. Said you had the right temperament for leadership. What did he mean by that? Intelligence, moral flexibility, understanding of how systems really work. Guy set down the coffee cup and moved closer. Police officers see society's dark side every day. Most develop either cynicism or denial. Your father developed entrepreneurial vision. But something in their story wasn't adding up. If Dad had really been planning to bring me into the operation, why had he hidden evidence that could destroy it? Why leave me documentation that exposed government connections and financial records? Show me the facility again, I said suddenly. If I'm going to make a decision about joining, I need to understand the full scope of operations. Paul and Guy exchanged glances. Something passed between them, doubt, maybe, or suspicion. That's not necessary right now, Paul said carefully. First, we need to recover our escaped asset. Then we can discuss your orientation process. The escaped asset has a name, I snapped. Lillian Edwards. She's a human being, not livestock. She's property, corrected flatly, acquired through significant investment of time and resources. Her unauthorized departure represents theft of valuable assets. The dehumanization in his voice triggered something in me that I couldn't control. Property. She's someone's daughter, maybe someone's sister. She had a life before you kidnapped her. She had a meaningless existence, hiking alone in dangerous wilderness, Paul replied. We gave her purpose, training, a future that would have provided security and value. You gave her a cage. We gave her structure, Guy corrected. Direction. Most of our assets eventually express gratitude for the opportunities we've provided. I thought about Sarah Mitchell, pressing her hand against the observation window with desperate hope in her eyes. Gratitude? Stockholm Syndrome is a well-documented psychological phenomenon, Paul explained clinically. With proper conditioning, subjects develop emotional attachment to their circumstances. It's actually quite humane. They learn to find satisfaction in their new roles. The casual discussion of psychological torture as a humane business practice made me realize just how far these men had descended into moral bankruptcy, but it also gave me insight into their methods and mindset. How long does the conditioning process usually take? Varies by individual resilience, Guy replied. Anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Your father developed very effective protocols for accelerating psychological adaptation. My father, even hearing them attribute these horrors to him felt like a betrayal of everything he'd taught me about justice and protecting the innocent. Hector appeared in the doorway. Found a clear trail heading toward the creek. She's moving fast, but favoring her left leg, probably injured. Guy nodded and turned back to me. Helena, we need to recover Lillian before she reaches the highway. Are you going to help us, or do we need to treat you as a hostile witness? The moment of truth had arrived. I could cooperate and buy myself time while more women suffer, or I could take a stand and likely end up in one of those cells myself. I thought about Dad's letter in my pocket, about the evidence he'd left behind, about Lillian's desperate escape through the night. Whatever my father had ultimately become, he'd left me the tools to bring this nightmare to an end. But first, I had to survive the next few hours. I'll help you track her, I said, making the hardest decision of my life. But I want something in return. Guy raised an eyebrow. You're hardly in a position to negotiate. I want to see my father's personal files, his real files, not just the operational manual. If I'm going to take over his role, I need to understand his complete methodology. Paul considered this for a moment. That can be arranged, but first, we recover Lillian. They allowed me to change into hiking boots and grab a jacket, though I noticed Guy stayed close enough to interfere if I tried anything suspicious. I palmed Dad's letter from the metal box when they weren't looking, shoving it deep into my jacket pocket. Outside, the morning mist was lifting from the forest floor, revealing the tracks Lillian had left in her desperate flight toward freedom. She'd tried to be careful, but injury and exhaustion had made her careless. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves, even a partial footprint in a patch of soft earth. The trail was clear enough for experienced trackers to follow.
Your father taught you outdoor skills? Hector asked as we moved through the trees. Some, more theoretical than practical. Robert was an excellent tracker, Paul added, could follow sign through terrain that would challenge most hunters. Said it was just applied observation, the same skills that made him a good detective. We followed Lillian's trail for about 20 minutes before Hector held up his hand, signaling us to stop. He knelt beside a fallen log and examined something on the ground. Blood, he announced. Fresh. She's hurt worse than we thought. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. Lillian was injured, alone, and being hunted by men who had years of experience tracking fleeing victims. Her chances of reaching the highway were diminishing with every passing minute. This way, Guy said, pointing toward a game trail that led deeper into the forest. She's trying to follow the creek, but the terrain is forcing her to circle back toward our perimeter. As we continued tracking, I began to understand the full scope of their security measures. Motion sensors hidden in trees, cameras disguised as birdhouses, even what appeared to be automated alert systems that would trigger if someone crossed certain invisible boundaries. Impressive setup, I commented, trying to gather intelligence while maintaining my cover. Your father's design, Paul replied proudly. He understood that the key to long-term success was controlling the environment completely. No surprises, no unplanned variables. How many people know about the operation? Need-to-know basis only, Guy answered. Local sheriff's department has been convinced we're running federal anti-terrorism surveillance. State agencies think we're part of a drug interdiction program. Everyone sees what they expect to see. The compartmentalization was brilliant and terrifying. No single agency had the complete picture, which meant no one could expose the full operation even if they wanted to. We found more blood at the next water source, a small stream where Lillian had apparently stopped to rest. The amount suggested her injury was serious enough to slow her down significantly. She won't make it to the highway at this rate, Hector observed clinically. Blood loss and exhaustion will force her to find shelter soon. Good, Guy replied. Better to recover her before she has a chance to contact anyone. I thought about Maggie, the other escaped woman who'd headed north toward the highway. Had she made it to safety, or was there another team tracking her as well? What happens to the ones who try to escape? I asked. Depends on the circumstances, Paul answered. First-time attempts usually result in modified conditioning protocols. Repeat offenses require more permanent solutions. More permanent solutions. They were talking about murder with the same casual tone they'd used to discuss pest control. As we moved deeper into the forest, I began to realize how isolated I'd become. My cell phone had no signal, the cabin's landline had been disabled, and I was surrounded by armed men who wouldn't hesitate to kill me if I became a liability.
Even if I could somehow escape, who would believe my story? Paul was a respected forest ranger with decades of service. Guy and Hector had cover identities that would probably check out under casual investigation. And my father, the man whose testimony would carry the most weight, was dead. There, Hector whispered, pointing toward a cluster of large boulders about 50 yards ahead. Movement. I strained my eyes and caught a glimpse of blonde hair between the rocks. Lillian had found a hiding spot, but not a good one. She was trapped in a natural bowl with limited escape routes. Standard approach, Guy instructed quietly. Helena, you call out to her. She might trust you more than us. They wanted me to betray a woman who'd risked everything to escape their prison, to lure her out of hiding so they could drag her back to that underground hell. What do I say? Tell her we're here to help, Paul suggested, that you're with search and rescue, responding to reports of missing hikers. The lie came so easily to him that I wondered how many times he'd used similar deceptions. How many women had trusted his ranger uniform and official authority, never suspecting they were walking into a trap. As we approached Lillian's hiding spot, I had to make another impossible choice. Play along and maintain my cover, possibly learning more about their operation, or warn Lillian and blow any chance of gathering evidence that could save the other women. Lillian, I called softly, it's Helena, Detective Elmsworth. I'm here with search and rescue. Movement in the rocks stopped. She was listening, trying to decide whether to trust my voice. Please come out, I continued, hating every word. You're hurt and need medical attention. A long moment passed before Lillian emerged from behind the largest boulder. She was pale, exhausted, and favoring her left leg heavily. Blood had soaked through her pants where she'd injured herself during the escape. When she saw Paul and the others with me, her face crumpled with betrayal and despair. You, she whispered, looking directly at me, you're one of them. Before I could respond, Guy stepped forward with a tranquilizer gun. The dart hit Lillian in the shoulder, and she collapsed within seconds. Excellent work, Paul said, clapping me on the shoulder like we were partners. Your father would be proud. As they loaded Lillian's unconscious form onto a portable stretcher, I realized the full horror of my situation. I hadn't just failed to save her, I'd actively participated in her recapture. And now, having proven my willingness to cooperate, they were going to show me exactly what my father had built in these mountains. Back at the facility, they carried Lillian's unconscious form through the security doors and down the corridor I'd walked the night before. But this time, they took me deeper into the complex, past the holding cells to areas I hadn't seen during my initial tour. Your father's real achievement wasn't the detention facility, Guy explained as we walked through a section marked Administrative Wing. That was just storage. The innovation was in the processing and distribution networks. He led me into what looked like a high-tech command center. Wall-mounted displays showed satellite feeds from locations around the world, real-time financial data, and what appeared to be shipping manifests. The scope of the operation was staggering. 12 countries, 43 distribution points, over 200 active assets in transit at any given time, Paul said with obvious pride. Your father didn't just build a local operation, he created a global supply chain. I stared at the displays, trying to comprehend the scale of human misery they represented. All of this from here? This is just the procurement and initial processing center, Hector explained. The real money is in the logistics network. Your father's law enforcement background gave him insights into how to move assets across borders without triggering investigations. They showed me shipping manifests disguised as agricultural exports, transportation routes that avoided high-security checkpoints, even corrupt officials who'd been paid to look the other way. Dad had built a machine for making women disappear on an industrial scale. The financial returns are extraordinary, Guy continued, pulling up profit reports on one of the monitors. Gross revenues last year exceeded $40 million. Your father's share alone was enough to fund retirement and expansion operations. $40 million. That explained how Dad had afforded the cabin, the land, all the sophisticated equipment. He hadn't just been a participant in this nightmare, he'd been getting rich from it. What was his exact role? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Strategic planning and operational security, Paul replied. He understood how law enforcement agencies coordinate investigations, how to create false trails, and redirect suspicion. His expertise made the entire network possible. They led me to another room filled with filing cabinets and computer servers. Your father's archive, Guy announced. Every operation, every transaction, every asset processed through the facility. He was obsessive about documentation. I spent the next hour reviewing files that painted a picture of systematic horror. Detailed profiles of hundreds of victims, psychological assessments used to break their resistance, even customer feedback forms from buyers rating their purchases. But as I dug deeper into Dad's files, I began to notice something the others had missed. Hidden among the operational records were copies of communications that didn't fit the pattern. Messages to federal agencies, encrypted files with names I didn't recognize, even what appeared to be surveillance reports on Paul and his associates. This communication log, I said, pointing to one of the files. Who was Dad talking to at the Justice Department? Paul looked over my shoulder and frowned. That was part of our cover operation, periodic reports to maintain the fiction that we were conducting authorized surveillance. But the dates didn't match. The communications I was seeing had continued right up until Dad's death, long after any reasonable cover operation would have ended. And the content I could decipher suggested Dad had been providing real intelligence about the trafficking network. My father had been playing both sides. I need some air, I said, closing the file cabinet. This is a lot to process. They escorted me back to the surface, where the afternoon sun felt surreal after hours in the underground facility. As we stood outside the entrance, Paul's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message. His expression darkened as he read the display. We have a problem. Maggie Ruffus made it to the highway. Local sheriff's department picked her up 3 hours ago. Guy cursed under his breath. What's her story? Claims she escaped from kidnappers who were holding her in an underground facility. She's demanding FBI involvement. The 3 men looked at each other with the kind of worried expressions I'd never seen from them before. For the first time since this nightmare began, they seemed genuinely concerned about consequences. How much does she know? Hector asked. Everything, Paul replied grimly. She was one of the long-term residents, knows the facility layout, guard schedules, even some of our operational procedures. I felt a surge of hope. Maggie had made it to safety and was talking to authorities. Even if they tried to discredit her story, it would trigger investigations that might expose the entire operation. What's the containment protocol? Guy asked. Paul consulted his phone again. We have contacts in the sheriff's department, but FBI involvement changes everything. We need to accelerate the timeline. Accelerate what timeline? Facility shutdown and asset liquidation, Paul replied. We always knew this day might come. Your father insisted on having contingency plans for total exposure. Asset liquidation. They were talking about killing all the women in the holding cells rather than risk them testifying against the operation. How much do we have? Guy asked. 12 hours, maybe less. FBI field agents are already en route from Seattle. 12 hours. 8 women were going to die in 12 hours, unless I could find a way to stop it. And I was beginning to suspect that Dad's hidden communications might contain the key to doing exactly that. We need to discuss your commitment level, Guy said as we drove back toward the cabin. The situation has become more fluid than anticipated. What kind of commitment? Full partnership or complete elimination, Paul replied from the driver's seat. There's no middle ground when federal agencies get involved. They were giving me an ultimatum: join their operation completely or become another victim. But they'd made a crucial mistake by showing me Dad's archive. Hidden in those files was information they didn't know existed. Back at the cabin, I asked for time alone to review the materials they'd given me. I need to understand the financial projections before making a decision of this magnitude, I said, trying to sound like someone evaluating a business opportunity rather than planning their destruction. You have 2 hours, Guy announced. Then we need your answer. After they left, I immediately retrieved Dad's letter from my jacket pocket. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper and read his final message. Helena, if you're reading this, then Paul and his associates have shown you the operation and tried to recruit you. Don't trust anything they've told you about my involvement. I went undercover 18 months ago at the request of a joint FBI-DEA task force investigating reports of missing hikers in this region. What I discovered was far worse than anyone suspected: an international trafficking network with connections to military contractors and government black sites. I couldn't extract the victims without blowing my cover and losing the chance to expose the entire network. Every day I stayed was another day of hell for those women, but it was also another piece of evidence that could save hundreds more. The flash drive hidden behind the bathroom mirror contains everything: financial records, client lists, government contacts, shipping manifests. 3 years of evidence that will destroy not just Paul's operation, but the entire network it serves. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth. I'm sorry you have to finish what I started, but you're the only person I trust with this responsibility. The activation code for the flash drive is your mother's maiden name followed by the date we first took you camping. You'll remember, it was the day you decided you wanted to be a cop like your old man. Save them, kiddo. Save them all. Dad. My mother's maiden name was Spencer. The camping trip was July 15th, 1995. I'd been 8 years old and obsessed with Dad's police stories. Spencer 071595. I committed the code to memory and burned the letter in the fireplace. Behind the bathroom mirror, exactly where Dad had said, I found a small flash drive sealed in a waterproof case. My hands trembled as I inserted it into my laptop and entered the activation code. The files that opened made me understand why Dad had been willing to sacrifice everything to gather this evidence. The trafficking network wasn't just about sexual slavery. It was supplying women to overseas military contractors for use in psychological warfare operations, medical experimentation, and even organ harvesting. Government emails showed officials discussing expendable assets and deniable procurement methods. Financial records traced payments from Pentagon black budgets to offshore accounts controlled by Paul's organization. Shipping manifests detailed human cargo disguised as everything from agricultural equipment to medical supplies. But most damning were the client communications. Military contractors requesting women with specific language skills for enhanced interrogation operations. Medical research facilities ordering subjects for drug trials that would never be approved through legitimate channels. Even diplomatic communications discussing the use of trafficking victims as expendable intelligence assets. My father had spent 3 years documenting a network that turned human beings into disposable tools for government and military operations, and he died before he could expose it. I copied everything to multiple flash drives, encrypting each one with different passwords. Then I began uploading files to secure cloud storage accounts, creating redundant copies that would survive even if I didn't. A sound outside made me freeze, the distinctive rumble of ATVs approaching fast. Through the window, I could see Paul and his team returning much earlier than expected. Something had changed their timeline. I quickly hid the flash drives and closed my laptop, but I could see from their body language that this wasn't a social visit. They moved with the focused urgency of men preparing for violence. Paul burst through the front door without knocking, his weapon drawn. FBI surveillance aircraft was spotted 20 minutes ago, he announced. We're moving to immediate liquidation protocols. What does that mean? It means we eliminate all evidence, Guy replied, following Paul inside. The facility, the assets, everything that could connect us to the operation. They were going to kill 8 women and destroy the facility to cover their tracks, and they'd clearly intended for me to disappear along with everything else. I'm sorry it worked out this way, Paul said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. Your father would have understood. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary to protect the larger operation. Hector appeared in the doorway carrying what looked like military-grade explosive equipment. Charges are set. Facility will be completely destroyed in 90 minutes. 90 minutes? 8 women were going to die in 90 minutes unless I could find a way to stop them. What about me? I asked, though I already knew the answer. You'll be remembered as a tragic victim of the same wilderness accident that claimed your father. Heart attack, probably brought on by stress and overexertion. Very believable, given your family history. They planned to kill me and make it look like natural causes. Just another sad story about someone who couldn't handle the isolation and stress of settling their father's estate.
But they'd made one crucial mistake. They still thought I was an innocent victim, not someone who'd inherited 3 years' worth of evidence that could destroy them all. Before we proceed, I said, trying to buy time while my mind raced through possibilities, I need to understand something. Why kill the women? Why not just relocate them? Paul lowered his weapon slightly, apparently viewing this as a reasonable business question. Transportation is compromised. The FBI surveillance means any movement will be tracked. Better to eliminate the evidence completely than risk exposure of the client network. And you're certain the FBI is investigating the trafficking specifically? Maggie's testimony was very detailed, Guy replied. She provided facility layouts, described operational procedures, even identified some of our personnel. Damage control requires total erasure. They were so focused on containing the immediate threat that they'd missed the larger problem. My father's evidence wasn't just about their local operation. It exposed government officials and military contractors at the highest levels, people who would sacrifice Paul and his team in a heartbeat to protect themselves. There's something you should know, I said, carefully, about my father's real activities here. The 3 men exchanged glances. What do you mean? Paul asked. I found communications he had with federal agencies, detailed reports about your operation, client lists, financial records, everything. Hector stepped forward aggressively. You're lying. Check the archive yourselves. Look for encrypted files dated within the last 6 months. Robert wasn't just documenting the operation for operational security, he was building a case against you. I could see doubt creeping into their expressions. Paul pulled out his satellite phone and made a quick call, presumably to someone at the facility who could access Dad's files remotely. What exactly did you find? Guy demanded. Evidence that my father was working undercover for a federal task force, communications with FBI handlers, intelligence reports about your operation, even surveillance footage he took without your knowledge. This wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough to what Dad's letter had revealed, and more importantly, it would make them paranoid about what other evidence might exist. Paul's phone buzzed with a return call. His face went pale as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Problem? Guy asked. Henderson found encrypted partitions in Robert's computer system, partitions we didn't know existed. Paul's voice was tight with controlled anger. There are files we've never seen, communications with federal agencies, even audio recordings of our planning sessions. The paranoia I'd hoped to create was spreading. They were beginning to realize that Dad had been playing a much deeper game than they'd suspected. How long has this betrayal been going on? Hector demanded, turning on me as if I was personally responsible for my father's actions. According to the timestamps, at least 2 years, I replied, making up details that sounded plausible. He was feeding information to federal investigators while helping you build the operation. Then why didn't they shut us down? Guy asked, but I could see he was already working out the answer. Because they wanted the entire network, I said. Your operation was just one piece of a larger investigation. They needed you operational to identify all the clients and distribution channels. The truth was sinking in. Dad hadn't just gathered evidence about a local trafficking ring, he'd been mapping an international network with government and military connections. And that evidence was still out there, still dangerous to people with the power to destroy them all. The FBI surveillance isn't about containing us, Paul realized. It's about recovering Robert's intelligence before we can destroy it. Which means they know about the evidence, Guy added, know where it's hidden, know what it contains. I pressed my advantage. The facility destruction won't solve your problem.
Even if you eliminate the physical evidence and all the witnesses, Robert's intelligence reports are already in federal hands. You're not just fighting exposure, you're fighting for your lives. What do you mean? Hector asked. Think about it. You've been providing services to government black sites and military contractors, people who don't officially exist, operations that were never authorized. When this comes out, those officials are going to need scapegoats. The room fell silent as they processed the implications. They'd been so focused on their immediate operation that they hadn't considered the broader political ramifications of exposure. The explosion timeline needs to change, Paul said finally. We can't just destroy evidence, we need to recover Robert's intelligence and eliminate anyone who might have seen it. Anyone like Helena, Guy said, looking directly at me. Anyone like Helena, Paul agreed. But they were too late. While they'd been debating strategy, I'd been quietly activating the emergency beacon Dad had hidden in his operational manual, a device designed to alert his federal handlers if the operation was compromised. Help was already on the way. The question was whether it would arrive in time to save the women in the facility or whether I'd just signed all our death warrants. Hector, take her to the facility, Paul ordered, his demeanor shifting to cold efficiency. We need to interrogate her about what else she might know. What about the explosion timeline? Guy asked. Delayed until we can recover all of Robert's intelligence, but prep the charges anyway. If federal agents breach the perimeter, we detonate everything. They zip-tied my hands behind my back and loaded me into the truck. As we drove through the forest toward the facility, I tried to calculate timing. The emergency beacon would take at least 30 minutes to reach federal receivers, assuming Dad's handlers were still monitoring the frequency. Response time would depend on how close backup units were positioned. I had maybe an hour before help arrived, if it arrived at all. The facility looked different in the afternoon light, more like the prison it actually was, less like the clinical research center they'd tried to present. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and I could see additional vehicles that hadn't been there during my first visit. Increased security due to the escape, Hector explained as we passed through multiple checkpoints. We can't afford any more surprises. Inside, they took me to a room I hadn't seen before, a stark interrogation chamber with concrete walls and a single metal table, the kind of place where people disappeared permanently. Tell us about your father's communications with federal agencies, Paul demanded, once they'd secured me to a chair. Who were his contacts? What intelligence did he pass along? I had to walk a careful line, provide enough information to keep them talking while protecting the real evidence I'd found. His primary contact was someone named Jennifer Walsh at the FBI, I said, inventing a name that sounded official. He reported to her monthly about your operational activities. Paul made notes on a tablet while Guy paced behind me. What kind of operational details? Client lists, shipping schedules, facility security measures. Everything you shared with him, he passed along to federal investigators. This was partially true. Dad's files did contain all of those details, even if he hadn't actually transmitted them to federal handlers. Did you make copies of any files? Hector asked. Everything's on my laptop back at the cabin. I was trying to understand the scope of what I'd inherited. Another partial truth. The files were on my laptop, along with multiple encrypted backups I'd uploaded to secure servers. Paul's satellite phone rang, interrupting the interrogation. His expression darkened as he listened to the caller. Federal aircraft are maintaining surveillance patterns, he reported after ending the call, but no movement toward ground operations yet. How long before they move in? Guy asked. Unknown. Could be hours, could be minutes. Depends on what intelligence they're working with. I hoped they were wrong about federal response times. 8 women were still locked in cells somewhere in this facility, and every minute of delay meant greater risk that Paul would decide to eliminate all witnesses. What about the liquidation timeline? Hector pressed. Standing by for my signal, Paul replied, but we need to recover Robert's intelligence first. Can't risk leaving evidence that implicates our government contacts. They left me alone in the interrogation room while they consulted with their security team. The walls were thick enough to muffle most sound, but I could hear raised voices and urgent radio chatter from the corridor outside. Something was making them nervous beyond just federal surveillance. Either the situation was deteriorating faster than they'd anticipated, or they'd discovered something in Dad's files that had escalated their panic. I tested the restraints securing me to the chair, professional zip ties that wouldn't break with conventional struggle. But the chair itself was older, with bolts that might be loose enough to work with if I could create the right leverage. Working carefully to avoid making noise, I began rocking the chair in small increments, testing the stability of its mounting points. The left rear leg had the slightest give, not enough to break free immediately, but potentially enough to work with if I had time. The sound of approaching footsteps made me stop. Paul entered with a laptop computer and a portable hard drive. "We're going to make this simple," he announced. "You're going to help us access your father's encrypted files, and then you're going to call your federal contacts and feed them misinformation about our location and capabilities. And if I refuse? Then we start eliminating the women in the holding cells one by one until you cooperate, beginning with Lillian Edwards, who seems to have developed a personal connection with you." The threat was delivered with casual brutality that made my blood run cold. Paul would absolutely follow through. These women's lives meant nothing to him beyond their value as leverage. "I'll need access to my laptop," I said. "The encryption keys are biometric, locked to my fingerprints." Paul smiled coldly. "That can be arranged, but remember, any attempt at deception will result in immediate consequences for our assets." As he prepared to retrieve my laptop from the cabin, I realized this might be my only chance to access Dad's real evidence and transmit it to federal authorities. The emergency beacon will bring help eventually, but I needed to ensure the evidence survived even if I didn't. The question was whether I could outmaneuver 3 experienced killers while restrained in an underground facility designed to contain much more desperate people than me. Paul returned 30 minutes later with my laptop and a portable satellite uplink system. "Federal surveillance has intensified," he reported to Guy and Hector. "We're running out of time." They positioned the laptop in front of me and cut the zip ties binding my hands, though Hector kept a gun trained on me from across the room. "Access your father's files," Paul ordered. My fingers trembled as I opened the laptop, not from fear, but from adrenaline. This was my chance to transmit Dad's evidence, but I had to be smarter than they were expecting. "The biometric scanner needs recalibration after being moved," I said, stalling for time while I navigated to a hidden partition on the hard drive. "It'll take a few minutes to recognize my fingerprints properly." What I was actually doing was accessing the emergency communication protocol Dad had built into his system, a way to transmit critical intelligence directly to federal handlers, using the facility's own satellite uplink. "Hurry up," Guy snapped, checking his watch. "We have maybe 20 minutes before we need to evacuate." I pretended to struggle with the encryption while quietly uploading Dad's files to federal servers. Financial records showing government payments for trafficking victims, client lists including military contractors and diplomatic personnel, even audio recordings of planning sessions where Paul and his associates discussed eliminating witnesses. "Got it," I announced as the upload completed. "Files are accessible now." Paul leaned over my shoulder to examine the screen, unaware that I'd just transmitted enough evidence to destroy his entire network. "Show me the communications with federal agents." I opened a folder containing Dad's fabricated cover communications, routine reports designed to maintain his fictional role as a federal informant, nothing that would expose the real scope of his intelligence gathering. "This is it?" Paul asked, suspiciously. "These reports are mostly operational summaries." He was careful about what he put in writing, I replied. Most of the detailed intelligence was transmitted verbally during scheduled calls. Before Paul could respond, an alarm began blaring throughout the facility. Red lights flashed in the corridor outside, and we could hear running footsteps and shouted orders. "Perimeter breach," Hector announced, checking his radio. "Multiple federal vehicles approaching from the north access road." Paul cursed and grabbed his satellite phone. "Initiate facility destruction," he ordered. "All charges, full detonation, 5-minute countdown." My blood ran cold. They were going to blow up the facility with everyone inside, the 8 women in the holding cells, any personnel who couldn't evacuate in time, and me. "What about recovering the intelligence?" Guy asked. "No time," Paul replied grimly. "Better to destroy everything than let it fall into federal hands." A voice came over the facility's intercom system. "This is FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh. You are surrounded. Release all hostages immediately and surrender peacefully." Jennifer Walsh, the fictional contact name I'd given them during interrogation. The federal agents were using information I'd provided, which meant they'd received my transmission and were coordinating their response accordingly. "How did they know that name?" Paul demanded, spinning toward me with dawning comprehension. "Because I gave it to them," I said. "Everything you've told me, everything you've shown me, it's all been transmitted to federal investigators." Paul's face contorted with rage. "You little—" The lights went out, plunging us into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Outside, we could hear the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching. 4 minutes to detonation," Hector announced. "We need to reach the emergency exit now." But Paul wasn't ready to run. He grabbed me by the hair and pressed his gun against my temple. "Call them off," he snarled. "Tell your federal friends to back down or I start executing hostages." "They won't negotiate for me," I said. "Then I guess you get to die knowing you failed to save those women." The sound of explosive charges echoing through the facility told me federal agents were breaching the security doors. They were coming, but the 5-minute countdown was still running. Even if they reached us in time, the facility would still explode with 8 innocent women trapped in the holding cells below. "The detonation system," I said desperately. "There has to be a way to disable it." "Manual override requires 2 keys, and Guy has the other one," Paul replied with a cold smile. "Even if you killed me, you couldn't stop the countdown." Guy was already heading for the emergency exit, clearly prioritizing his own survival over continuing the standoff. In less than 3 minutes, this entire facility would be reduced to rubble, unless I could find another way to save the women trapped below. The sound of gunfire erupted in the corridor outside as federal agents engaged with facility security. Paul's grip on my hair tightened, his weapon pressed harder against my skull. 2 minutes to detonation," Hector announced, his voice tight with panic. "Paul, we need to go now." But Paul was beyond rational thought. "She dies first," he snarled, "then we run." That's when the door exploded inward. Federal agents in tactical gear flooded into the room, weapons trained on Paul and Hector. "Drop your weapons, release the hostage." In the chaos that followed, Paul's attention wavered for just a moment, long enough for me to drive my elbow backward into his stomach and break free from his grip. I dove toward the laptop as gunfire erupted around me. Paul went down under a hail of bullets, but Hector managed to reach the emergency exit. Through the tactical radio chatter, I could hear agents calling for evacuation. They knew about the countdown and were touting their response accordingly. "The holding cells," I shouted to the lead agent over the noise. 8 women trapped in the detention level. We have less than 90 seconds. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, the real Jennifer Walsh, not the fictional contact I'd invented, grabbed my shoulder. "Where exactly?" "Sublevel 2, Corridor C. Electronic locks controlled from the security station." She spoke rapidly into her radio, coordinating with other teams already in the facility, but I could see the grim calculation in her eyes. There wasn't enough time to evacuate everyone. "The manual override," I said, remembering Paul's words. "The detonation system requires 2 keys. Guy has one, but Paul's body might have the other." Agent Walsh and I searched Paul's corpse while explosions echoed through the facility as other agents breached security doors. In his jacket pocket, I found a small metal key attached to a chain around his neck. "Security station is this way," I said, leading Walsh through corridors I'd memorized during my tours of the facility. We reached the control room with 45 seconds remaining on the countdown. The manual override panel was behind a locked steel cabinet, but Walsh's tactical team made short work of the barrier. 2 keyholes, side by side, with a digital readout showing 30 seconds remaining. I inserted Paul's key while Walsh contacted her teams about Guy's location. "Subject in custody," came the radio response, "extracting override key now." 20 seconds. An agent burst into the control room carrying Guy's key. Walsh grabbed it and inserted it into the second keyhole. "Turn them simultaneously," she ordered. 15 seconds. We turned the keys together. The countdown stopped at 8 seconds, the red digital display freezing before going dark. Emergency lighting continued to bathe the facility in an eerie red glow, but the immediate threat of explosion had passed. Over the radio, I could hear agents reporting successful evacuation of all detained women from the holding cells. "Medical teams to detention level," Walsh ordered, multiple victims requiring immediate attention. As we made our way through the facility toward the surface, I saw federal agents leading the rescued women to safety. Sarah Mitchell, who I'd first seen through the observation window. Lillian Edwards, barely conscious but alive. 6 others, whose names I didn't know, but whose faces would haunt my dreams for years. They looked like ghosts, pale, malnourished, psychologically broken by months or years of captivity, but they were alive and they were free. Outside, the mountain clearing had been transformed into a federal command center. Helicopters landed and took off, ferrying victims to medical facilities. Crime scene technicians documented everything, while agents coordinated the massive investigation that would be required to dismantle the entire trafficking network. Agent Walsh found me sitting on a fallen log, trying to process everything that had happened. "Your father's intelligence was extraordinary," she said. 3 years of undercover work, documenting a network we'd been trying to penetrate for over a decade. "He never told me," I said. "I thought he was one of them." That was the point. His cover had to be perfect, even from family members. The risk of exposure was too high. She handed me a satellite phone. "There's someone who wants to talk to you." The voice on the other end was warm, familiar, impossible. "Hello, kiddo." "Dad?" I whispered, my world spinning. "I'm sorry, Helena. I'm so sorry you had to go through this. But you saved them. You saved them all." The revelation that my father was still alive hit me like a physical blow. Everything I'd believed about his death, about inheriting his legacy of horror, crumbled in an instant. "The heart attack," I managed to whisper into the satellite phone, "the park ranger who found you?" "Staged," Dad's voice confirmed. "We had to extract me from the aberration before Paul and his associates became suspicious. The only way to maintain the integrity of the investigation was to make everyone believe I was dead." Agent Walsh took the phone back. "Your father has been in federal protective custody for the past week," she explained. "His testimony will be crucial for prosecuting not just the local operation, but the government officials and military contractors who enabled it." Over the following hours, the scope of the investigation became clear. Dad's 3 years of undercover work had exposed a trafficking network that spanned 12 countries and involved dozens of high-ranking officials. The evidence I'd transmitted from the facility would lead to arrests across multiple federal agencies and military commands. "The women we rescued," I asked Agent Walsh as medical helicopters continued evacuating victims. "What happens to them now?" "Long-term rehabilitation," she replied. "Physical and psychological treatment, victim services support, and eventually testimony in federal court. Some of them have been captive for over 2 years. The recovery process will take time." I watched as Lillian Edwards was loaded onto a helicopter, her hand reaching out toward me as the aircraft lifted off. I'd failed her initially, but she was alive. They were all alive. "Your father wanted to tell you the truth," Agent Walsh continued, "but the operation required complete compartmentalization. Even family members couldn't know." "How many people were involved?" "The trafficking network? Over 200 arrests are planned across 6 countries. But the government conspiracy goes much deeper. Pentagon officials, intelligence contractors, even some diplomatic personnel. Your father's evidence has triggered the largest corruption investigation in federal law enforcement history." The legal proceedings that followed were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. grand jury testimonies, congressional hearings, international extradition requests. Dad's undercover operation had collected evidence on trafficking networks that supplied women to military black sites, medical research facilities, and private contractors operating in conflict zones. The trials took 2 years. Paul Gustav was dead, killed during the facility raid, but Guy Edwards and Hector Ruffus faced federal charges for human trafficking, conspiracy, and murder. Their convictions led to life sentences without possibility of parole. But the real justice came from the higher-level prosecutions. Pentagon officials who'd authorized payments for trafficking victims were sentenced to decades in prison. Military contractors lost billions in federal contracts. Intelligence agencies underwent complete restructuring to prevent similar operations. The 8 women we'd rescued became the key witnesses whose testimony brought down the entire network. Sarah Mitchell, who'd been held for 2 years, delivered devastating testimony about the psychological conditioning and abuse they'd endured. Lillian Edwards, despite her trauma, provided crucial intelligence about the facility's operations and client procedures. They were so brave, I told Dad during one of our supervised visits while he remained in protective custody. After everything they'd been through, they still found the courage to testify. That's what justice requires sometimes, he replied. Ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when it matters most. The cabin became evidence in the federal investigation, sealed off while investigators documented every detail of the operation. I never returned there. Too many memories of discovery and betrayal, even knowing now that Dad had been working to expose the horrors rather than perpetuate them. The inheritance I'd thought was my father's final gift turned out to be exactly that, just not in the way I'd expected. Instead of a peaceful retreat, he'd left me the tools to expose one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in modern history. "I'm proud of you," he said during our final conversation before entering the witness protection program. "You finished what I started. You brought them home." 6 months after the facility raid, I received a letter forwarded through federal channels. No return address, but I recognized Lillian Edwards' handwriting from the witness statements I'd reviewed. "Detective Elmsworth, I wanted you to know that I'm doing better. The nightmares are less frequent now, and I'm starting to remember who I was before. Sarah and I keep in touch. We're both in college now, trying to rebuild our lives. Thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for seeing us as people worth saving. We won't forget. Lillian." It was the letter that finally let me sleep through the night without seeing those observation windows and hearing the desperate hope in their voices. 3 years have passed since that week in the mountains that changed everything. I still work for the Seattle PD, but I've transferred to the Human Trafficking Task Force, a unit that didn't exist before the investigation my father's evidence made possible. The work is different now. Instead of responding to domestic violence calls and petty crimes, I spend my days identifying trafficking networks and coordinating with federal agencies to rescue victims. The skills I learned during those terrifying days at the cabin, reading hidden patterns, recognizing deception, understanding how predators operate, have made me better at my job than I ever thought possible. My new partner, Detective Marcus Reed, knows my story. Everyone in law enforcement does. The case became legendary, studied in academies and referenced in textbooks about undercover operations. But Marcus sees past the notoriety to the person I've become since. "You're different from other cops," he told me recently as we reviewed case files for a suspected trafficking operation in the port of Seattle. "You understand what the victims have been through in a way that most of us can't." He's right. When I interview rescued women, I see Lillian's desperate eyes and Sarah's pleading gestures. I remember the sound of electronic locks and the clinical language traffickers use to dehumanize their victims. That experience, horrible as it was, gives me credibility with survivors that years of training never could. The cabin property was eventually released back to me after the investigation concluded. I sold it to the National Park Service, which incorporated the land into the existing wilderness preserve. There's a small memorial there now, a simple stone marker acknowledging the women who suffered and died in those mountains and honoring the courage of those who survived. I visit sometimes, hiking the trails where Lillian once fled through the darkness toward an uncertain freedom. The forest has reclaimed most signs of the facility. Federal investigators filled in the underground complex and demolished the surface structures. Only someone who knew what to look for would recognize the slightly depressed ground where the building once stood. Dad remained in witness protection for 2 years before the last of the appeals were exhausted and the remaining conspirators were safely behind bars. We see each other regularly now, though our relationship will never be quite the same. The man I thought I knew, the straightforward cop who taught me about justice and protecting the innocent, was real, but he was also capable of deceptions I never imagined. "Do you regret it?" I asked him during our most recent dinner together. "The undercover work, the isolation, having to fake your own death?" He considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret that you had to be involved. I regret that those women suffered while I gathered evidence. But I don't regret bringing down the network. Sometimes the only way to stop evil is to get close enough to understand how it works." The women we rescued have found different paths to healing. Sarah Mitchell completed her teaching degree and now works with at-risk youth, using her experience to help other survivors. Lillian Edwards became a victim advocate, providing support to women transitioning out of trafficking situations. 2 others started a nonprofit organization that trains law enforcement officers to recognize signs of human trafficking. Not all the survivors thrived. The psychological damage was too severe for some to fully overcome. But even those who struggle daily have found ways to reclaim pieces of their identities and build lives worth living. The larger investigation my father's evidence triggered continues to this day. International law enforcement agencies are still identifying victims and dismantling networks in countries around the world. The financial records Dad collected led to frozen assets worth over $200 million, money that's being used to fund victim services and prevention programs. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices that week, if I'd trusted Paul Gustav's explanations and never searched for the truth, if I'd run when I first discovered the evidence instead of staying to investigate, if I'd prioritized my own safety over the lives of women I didn't even know. But I learned something important during those days in the mountains. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite fear when someone else's life depends on it. My father understood that. The women who testified despite their trauma understood that. And somewhere in that terrifying week, I finally understood it too. The inheritance I received wasn't land or money or even the cabin itself. It was the knowledge that ordinary people can choose to do extraordinary things when faced with evil that masquerades as normalcy. And sometimes that choice makes all the difference in the world. I still check behind rugs for hidden doors, still notice when security seems excessive for the stated purpose, still listen for inconsistencies in people's stories. The hypervigilance that kept me alive that week has never fully faded. But I've learned to see it as a gift rather than a burden. In a world where predators often hide behind authority and respectability, someone needs to be watching. Someone needs to be asking the questions that make uncomfortable people squirm. Sometimes that someone is a cop's daughter who inherited more than she bargained for. And sometimes that's exactly what the world needs.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.